Hey, Lindsay, Rhodes and Sam Bruchhaus here from Sumer Sports at Circa in Las Vegas for the Ultimate Contest Week. And we're talking a lot about fantasy football with all of our friends here. And one of the biggest names that's come up, and it's not one of the biggest names, but one of the biggest names that people want to talk about is Bill Croskey-Merritt, who we will now transition to calling Bill forever. It does not roll off the tongue. Bill Croskey-Merritt doesn't roll off the tongue, but what really doesn't roll off the tongue is Bill Croskey-Merritt.
You got to call the guy by what he wants to go by.
100%. I'm on board. I will retrain myself, but it's a tough one. It's a little bit clunky, and so I'm going to work on that. So he has been an interesting guy here because he was a 7th-round draft pick and has been garnering a lot of buzz in training camp, so much so, and never more so than within the last week when news came out that they were maybe open to trading Brian Robinson. And so now from a fantasy football standpoint, people are kind of clamoring to pick him up, move him up draft boards. And so the conversation that we want to have is, how high does he need to move up your draft board? What makes sense? How high is too high? And what is actually a realistic expectation to have for a running back that was drafted a few months ago in the 7th round of the actual draft? So where do we want to start with this? Where he's actually going in drafts right now and how this has changed in the last week? Or do you want to talk about who he actually is as a running back? Let's start there.
I think that's where we have to start, because as a data scientist, when you're building a prior, as it's called, it's not my favorite word to use because it's a little technical, but when you're trying to build out what you think this player will do, given that he has no NFL data, you look at a couple of things. Number one, you look at running back performance of 7th-round draft picks, and that's 0. You can basically put it down as 0. Second contract is basically 0%.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's pretty rough. So like once you get to the 7th round, you're thinking of guys that you kind of hope can maybe make the team.
Wow.
And so it's a tough projection from there. So I think what you would typically try to do, given they typically stabilize at some point, would be to use fantasy draft consensus. That is no longer there for us anymore, because in the past couple weeks, he's risen from undrafted to all of a sudden being considered in the single-digit rounds. And that's such a massive jump in expectation, even regardless of him being a rookie. If you'd ever see that, it would be due to something interesting. So I think the best way that you could build your prior now is by looking at the second depth chart position across the league, and in particular, historical guys who have filled that need, who have been kind of a running back 2 going into the season, but are expected to get some carries as well. It's an interesting scenario now that Brian Robinson is allegedly on the trade block. Austin Eckler is not necessarily an every down back anymore, and he's really just a unique back altogether because he's used a little bit more as a pass blocker and wide receiver than he is necessarily a running back. But I think you try to keep all of those things in mind and really try to base it off of just a core running back 2 in this league at this point.
So first of all, let's back up and talk about why we're talking about him having a big role in Washington, right? First of all, I mentioned the buzz coming out of training camp. Again, I want to be clear that some of that, it's not always discernible, but I think that we're discerning this buzz from other buzz. Like, it's not a flashy play. It's
well, I mean, it literally is a flashy play. Like, he got a lot of snaps in a primetime preseason game. He had a 40-yard rush. But
I'm saying that's not why we're saying, oh my gosh, look at how good he is. He had a good run in the preseason. It's not that. There are good runs in the preseason. There are good runs consistently throughout training camp.
Yes.
There are beat writers there that are saying, I don't know how you keep him off the field. Like, the buzz is building in such a way where it feels like there's signal attached to it, and not just, again, what we've talked about before, beware the highlight play during training camp. It's not just one or two quick viral moments where we're going, oh my God, the talent. It's consistent production compared to the other people that they have on the team. And so this is a backfield that wasn't particularly speedy, in the past, so you could look for an upgrade in that department. Maybe he has that. And I also think that you've made a point to me in conversation that is really important. We've talked about trying to identify which players might outplay their draft position, not fantasy draft position, real draft position, and what circumstances exist. We talked about this with Keandre Lambert-Smith, who has a whole sample size of data from college.
Right.
Like, there aren't a lot of evaluation question marks left behind. Like you've mentioned, Puka, coming off an injury, there's a reason to explain why he would fall in the draft.
Right.
And why he could outplay his draft position. Those exist for Bill Croskey-Merritt also.
Right, and I think because of the variance of a player who had weird eligibility issues, we've literally never seen on an FBS like major level P5 scale as compared to even an NFL scale. That leads to a pretty wide distribution. I think the way that I look at it now, and Lindsay, in conversation, you made a great counterpoint, is that if the coaches, Cliff Kingsbury and Dan Quinn, who have been in the league for a very long time, think that he is better than Brian Robinson at whatever they needed Brian Robinson to do, which we have seen on the NFL field, that means that at least in their head, they're not thinking about fantasy football.
Right.
But in their head, their projection is at least Brian Robinson.
Exactly.
Now,
with a potential ceiling attached to that
Exactly.
is upwards of Brian Robinson, right?
Exactly.
Otherwise, you don't make this move.
Exactly. So I think the way, from a data perspective, you would look at this is you would center it probably slightly lower than Brian Robinson's average, or if we're talking about ADP, you'd probably take him slightly lower than where you would see Brian Robinson going settled probably before any of this news came out.
Okay.
But the distribution is a lot wider. As you said, I think the coaches think that. I think at this point the general managers think that. Obviously, they're getting ready to trade him. And I think that we as data scientists also can think that as well. So I think that's kind of what we're dealing with right now, is you're probably looking at around Brian Robinson's ADP, potentially a little lower, and then widening out that distribution, maybe trying to take a shot.
I'm looking at ADPs right now, by the way, totally listening to you, not paying attention, looking at my screen because, so Brian Robinson in the last 2 weeks, and I'm looking at NFFC ADPs, I'm looking at high stakes drafts, right? So like really sharp drafters, ADPs will be different for home leagues, but in the last 2 weeks, Brian Robinson's going middle of the 8th. Within the last week, he's now dropped to the 9th round. And let's see where in the last week, hold on, I'm looking for Croskey-Merritt. Now he's ADP 12-5. So the 5th pick of the 12th round is his ADP in these drafts that have taken place within the last week. So one of the things that I have had a legitimate curiosity about since we got here, I've done 2 drafts myself since we've been in Las Vegas, is where is he going to go in these drafts?
Right.
Because we're going to continue to see him going up and up and up. So I did a draft yesterday for Sports Illustrated, and I had this ADP in mind, and I'm going, okay, 12. I think that we're in a range now once I got to the 10th round where I was like, I think I kind of like him coming up soon. I'm going to put him in my queue. I'm going to wait for him to come back to me in the 11th, and I'll pull him up around. I'm fine with that. And so I drafted somebody else, and then, no, actually, I'm sorry. It must have been the 9th round I started thinking about this because he went 10-1 in that draft. And I went, whoa, that's 2 rounds higher. That's all round higher than I thought I was probably safe to grab him. So that's number 1 here, like already moving up. Then I did another draft today, and for the Women of Fantasy Football and the Fantasy Football World Championship Series, and he went 8-9. And the person that took him is a high-stakes player who has been the Fantasy Football World Champion and is consistently in the top 10. But so she went and pulled him up to 8-9. Now, noteworthy, the high-stakes players, they're all about win or nothing. Like, it doesn't matter if you come in second. So you're looking for that type of upside.
Yeah.
So that makes sense that you would pull him up if that's your thought process there is like, I'm going to make a ton of money or I'm just nothing. It doesn't matter. But 8-9 is where he went.
Right.
So the same thing happened to me again where I was in this range and I had J.K. Dobbins queued and then Ja'Cory also in the queue. And then Ja'Cory actually Bill went 1 spot before I took JK.
Right.
Which is kind of wild because JK, we've talked about how we actually like him with the Broncos this year. It looks like he's going to start the season with a pretty big role. And then you've got this guy who was a 7th round draft pick that's now suddenly in the same draft range, which I think is kind of wild. Is that too high, or is that actually, are we going to see it go up even further?
I think in any given fantasy draft, it could be weird. Like I think that J.K. Dobbins probably on average should be substantially better than Bill Croskey-Merritt this year.
I told you it's hard.
Yeah, so it's like It's weird to differentiate. But here's the way I'm trying to think about it, and I'm just gonna throw like yes or no, or you feel good or bad about these levels of uncertainty. So there's a couple things that make this uncertain. Number one, the idea that he's an FCS running back, 7th round pick. You feel good or bad about that variance that is added by that?
It doesn't scare me because of the things that you said.
Exactly.
And I also think, with regards to just the 7th round pick, if there is a position in football that I'm okay with taking a late round pick because of positional value.
Yeah.
We've talked just at draft time about how that being a smart strategy. This was a year where we talked about how there were a lot of good running backs. We've talked ad nauseum about how running back is environmental. And so the boost that you get for having an elite running back, minimal. You have to go to the right team.
Right.
Whereas if you are a good enough running back, like we can work with this in a good offense, that good enough running back can look very, very good. And from a fantasy football standpoint, all we're looking for is opportunities. So we just need this good offense to say, you're good enough to be our guy. For whatever reason that you've made that determination, I think he's set up to succeed. If he goes in and he gets the Brian Robinson carries and they think this is a guy that, as we talked about, is maybe better than Brian Robinson, and so there's more upside to that, absolutely. Long-winded answer to your question, those things don't
You feel
scare
good
me.
about it. You're buying the variance.
Absolutely.
How do you feel about the variance that Brian Robinson might not actually end up being traded? Because that's a tough deal to pull off, especially given that he would be a significantly depressed asset. Teams really look at drafts, for better or worse. I'd consider for worse.
What are you going to get for Brian Robinson in terms of
exactly? If you're saying a 7th round running back is better than Brian Robinson right now.
That's a rough look.
It's a rough sell.
And so Brian Robinson sticks around. If they're willing to talk about trading Brian Robinson, then I think that if they can't trade Brian Robinson, then they have to still put Brian Robinson on the shelf.
You think so? You think he wouldn't get carries?
If they have a running back that they think is better for that scenario than Brian Robinson, so much so that they would be willing to trade Brian Robinson, then I think that.
It's interesting. I agree with you. I feel good about the variance on the front side. On the player side, I feel good about the variance. I feel good that he's probably better than a 7th round pick. I feel good that he's a rookie. I feel good that he's probably will be more the runny runner than Austin Eckler.
Runny runner.
What I'm worried about is I don't think if they think they can get value for Brian Robinson, that indicates to me that they think, at least to a little degree, that there's a trade market for him, which indicates on the full back end that they still view him as valuable. They just view a pick plus Croskey-Merritt playing as better value than just Brian Robinson.
That's what we have to determine right now.
Exactly. So what we're trying to figure out is he a completely depressed asset and they're just trying to get out of Dodge? Or do they think that the value of a 5th or 6th round pick for Brian Robinson plus Croskey-Merritt playing those snaps is a better long-term play for them?
Another way of looking at that, they look at Ja'Cory Croskey-Merritt and they're like, I hate to do this because this is what I'm just saying. This is an alternate scenario. We have no idea what's happening. Terrell Davis was a 6th round pick. There are running backs who are late. You said never a 7th, but like there are running backs who are late round picks or go undrafted, end up on a team and are legitimately good. And we've outlined the reasons that we might have missed on Ja'Cory Croskey-Merritt. Bill Croskey-Merritt would have flown under the radar playing for Alabama State. Right? And being a good player in that conference that very few people are paying attention to and not getting, because of a clerical error, an opportunity to prove that he could be very good at a high level. There are reasons that we could have missed on him. He's always been good. He's always been good against the competition. It's just there are built-in reasons for you to have not necessarily felt comfortable taking a swing on him. Now you get him on the field and you go, oh, shit, right? Like, it's entirely possible that this has nothing to do with Brian Robinson and everything to do with Bill Croskey-Merritt. And if that's true, then is there a spot that's too high? I mean, yes, because we're comparing him to other people where the floor is higher, right? But we don't know what the ceiling is there. Maybe that's worth discussing. Let's just say for 5 seconds that he is the second coming and he's so freaking good. And that's what's actually happening here. What is the ceiling? in that scenario in that offense.
Right. So I think the ceiling, I think we saw the ceiling last year, and I think it's a very interesting
How
discussion.
could the ceiling be Brian Robinson?
Well, wait.
Okay.
I think we saw the ceiling last year, and I think the reason why we saw the ceiling last year is because this is a very considering a mid to late round draft pick. It's a little different for running backs, but I think this is a very similar scenario to what we saw with Bucky Irving last year, where Bucky Irving was a fourth round pick, much higher in the running back market. However, we knew, as we kind of know now, that he was going to be the certified running back 2 going into the season. He got 9 carries week 1, and we saw Rachaad White, who is probably a little on running on 2 better legs than Austin Eckler at this point, but is a very similar running back in that he probably provides you with more receiving help than he does rushing help.
Yeah.
And so the question becomes is, what is the massive difference between Bill Croskey-Merritt right now and Bucky Irving then? And do you think that the ceiling is Bucky Irving's year last year, where he ends up being a top 5 running back when it really comes down to it at the end of the year, is winning people leagues, has excellent analytics? Because I think that's the ceiling at this point.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And by the way, at this time last year, Bucky Irving was going, we pulled up his ADP numbers, he was RB 54.
Yeah, so it's like
with an ADP of 169. So he was a late round draft pick. He was probably undrafted in a lot of, smaller leagues, and an early waiver wire pickup. The thing with Bucky that I thought was identifiable last year, though, was some of the things that you talked about with Rachaad White's lower efficiency numbers. I always thought, and he didn't get out of a single draft that I was in, because I thought he has a role here and he has a chance to usurp. He will be the RB2 immediately. He's on the field with the chance to be the RB1, because he does things that Rachaad White doesn't do well in terms of efficiency, or at least we're betting that he will, and then it turned out we were right. And also he is still good in the pass catching game. So Rachaad White also still had value and was a big part of the offense, but I could see a scenario where you could literally lift him out and go, Bucky can do all this. Right? And I don't know if that affects his efficiency numbers if it gets watered down or something like that, especially in the long term. But as far as Bill Croskey-Merritt, is he good in the passing game? Like, that's also a component that we have to think about. Is he just, like, does Eckler, is his role in the offense secure? Or is there a chance that Bill Croskey-Merritt, Bill, has the skill set to overtake both of those jobs at some point? And I think that's the ceiling conversation for him.
I'm trying to get into a heuristic of how to pick where to properly
What does
select
heuristic
him.
mean?
I'm trying to get into a formula of how to figure out where to properly pick him. And so tell me if I'm wrong on any of these. Feel free to butt in. I think you start at Brian Robinson's probably peak ADP this year.
Okay.
And that's probably the top of where you should consider selecting him. Just because that's the slot, that's what we think about the offensive line, that's what we think about the offense, that's what we think about the role we expect him to have. So I think that should be probably the top, maybe like the 75th, 80th percentile of where you should consider it. Maybe you reach a little bit over that, but I think that's probably the top. Then we go to try to get a sense of the average as compared to last year, Bucky Irving at running back 54. The middle of that and where you think it is how you feel about the potential that Brian Robinson still gets carries, what you think about Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury having a vote of confidence for Croskey-Merritt, and then what you just said. Is there Rachaad White being overtaken view of this where Croskey-Merritt becomes like that Bucky Irving? And so I think between running back 54 and running back whatever Brian Robinson was, if you feel really good that Brian Robinson is going to be off this team, you put it a little closer to where Brian Robinson was. If you feel that, like I'm kind of feeling right now, that they think there's a market for Brian Robinson, maybe you move it a little bit back. But I think that's a very wide distribution, by the way. It's probably like a 30-spot running back spot. But, like, I think that's how you can start, like, at least putting numbers to it and figuring out where you are on that spectrum of, like, I'm going to just wait and see if I can get him late, or I'm going to try to jump up and get him.
And there is a fair component of risk assessment attached to this in that we're talking about all of the upside and what it could be, but there is a low floor, and that from a fantasy football ADP has to be factored in, right? Like you could say, well, I think he could end up being,
right.
Like Bucky Irving was last year in fantasy football, but also he might be nothing. So I think that your point is fair in that. So it looks like in July, before training camps started, Brian Robinson was going into the 7th. Like that's like what we're looking at. That's probably,
and we're getting close to in the real high stakes ball knower markets. We're getting close to that right now.
That's wild.
Yeah,
that's wild. But also very, very fun. So we'll see how much he continues to rise, and how high will be too high. Like I'll be honest with you again. 8-9 is where he went today. I wouldn't have taken him at 8-10 because I like J.K. Dobbins better. But if the person in front of me had taken J.K. Dobbins instead, I might have taken Bill Croskey-Merritt, Bill, at 8-10. And that feels like something that I wouldn't have said a few weeks ago. But he starts to get into a range of people that I'm like, nah, I'm not that excited about any of these other options, so I'll bet on the upside.
You're buying the
here.
Vance. You're buying the upside.
Yeah.
Makes
This
sense.
is going to be a fun one to track. For more information about all of these players, by the way, we have our draft guide still online. He is not featured in that as a 7th round running back.
There's no quality P5 stats.
But lots of interesting data points that you can go find about all of the other rookies that you're thinking about drafting, and also a lot of data points on the rest of the league at sumersports.com.